Thomas Brooks and Daniel Pierce vanished from Stonebridge in 1982, the same night their two best friends were never seen again. 40 years later, they returned, without explanation, without remorse, and carrying a secret so terrifying. It would unravel everything the town thought it knew about that summer night. The town of Stonebridge was the kind of place people forgot even existed. Hidden behind thickets of pine trees and dusty, winding roads, it sat untouched by time. There were no skyscrapers, no highways, no large stores, only small shops, a faded gas station, and weathered houses that looked like they had stood there forever. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where secrets didn't last long, unless they were buried deep enough. Eleanor Brooks had lived in Stonebridge all her life. She was a quiet woman, now in her 70s, with a routine that rarely changed. Every morning, she walked to the bakery for a coffee and a roll, nodded at the grocer's clerk, then returned to her house on Willow Lane. The neighbors barely heard a sound from her home. It was always spotless, the curtains drawn, the front steps freshly swept. She had once been the town librarian, respected and admired. But there was a silence about her, one that had grown over the years like a heavy fog. Everyone knew she had lost her husband in the summer of 1982. One day he left for work and simply never returned. And a few months later, her teenage son Thomas left town too. No warning, no farewell, just gone. Some whispered that Eleanor had driven him away with grief. Others claimed he'd seen something that made him run. But in time, people stopped asking. The house on Willow Lane became part of the landscape, quiet, still, forgotten. Then one afternoon in early autumn, a dusty gray car pulled into her driveway. The driver stepped out, tall and thinner than most remembered, but unmistakable. Thomas Brooks had come home. He was older now, in his 50s, with a weathered face and sunken eyes that looked like they had seen too much. He didn't bring luggage or flowers or explanations. He only brought another man with him, Daniel Pierce, his childhood friend, who had also vanished from town around the same time as Thomas. Daniel looked worse, hollowed out, hair graying at the temples, with hands that trembled even when they weren't holding anything. They said nothing as they entered Eleanor's home. She opened the door without hesitation, as if she'd been expecting them for years. News spread quickly. Stonebridge was not a place where you could disappear and reappear unnoticed. People gossiped in church halls and barbershops. Why had they come back after all this time? Where had they been? Why now? The two men did little to answer those questions. They didn't seek out old friends or visit familiar places. Instead, they kept to Eleanor's house, coming and going only at night. Sometimes, locals saw them driving toward the woods beyond Miller's Creek. They always took the same path, always returned hours later with mud on their boots and distant looks in their eyes. One morning, Thomas was seen digging behind Eleanor's garden. Not a small hole, but a deep, square trench. When asked what he was doing, he muttered something about clearing roots. No one believed him. Sheriff Calhoun, long retired but still alert, took notice. He had been a young deputy in 1982, just beginning his career when the town was shaken by the disappearance of two local boys, Michael Rourke and James Talley. They had gone camping with Thomas and Daniel in the woods and were never seen again. At the time, Thomas and Daniel claimed the group had gotten separated during a thunderstorm. Rescue teams found nothing. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints, no gear left behind, just an empty tent and silence. The case went cold, and then Thomas and Daniel vanished too. Sheriff Calhoun had never believed the story. Something about the way the boys had acted upon returning, how quickly they left town afterward, how their families refused to speak of it. But with no evidence, there was nothing he could do. The case became one of Stonebridge's many unsolved mysteries. Until now, watching them now, Calhoun couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming undone. Thomas looked like a man haunted by something he could no longer keep buried. Daniel, though quieter, seemed on edge, glancing over his shoulder, constantly jumping at small noises. Calhoun began driving the old patrol truck again, unofficially, of course. He watched their movements. He took photos. He even followed them once, deep into the woods, but turned back when he saw the freshly dug earth and what looked like wooden beams sticking out from the ground. Eleanor, for her part, said nothing to anyone, but her neighbors noticed that she had started keeping the porch light on every night, even though no one came to visit. They also noticed that the curtains remained closed all day, and the mailbox, usually checked every morning, began to overflow. Then, 3 weeks after the return of Thomas and Daniel, something shifted. A woman walking her dog near Miller's Creek stumbled onto an odd patch of ground. The dog refused to move forward and began barking at the soil. When she approached, the earth gave way beneath her foot. Underneath was what appeared to be a collapsed tunnel or pit. She called the authorities. By sunset, the area was taped off. Police unearthed skeletal remains, 2 sets, both buried several feet down, their arms tied behind their backs with rotted rope. The discovery stunned the town. The bodies were sent for forensic testing. Sheriff Calhoun, called in as a consultant, already knew what the results would be. And within days, the lab confirmed it. The bones belonged to Michael Rourke and James Talley. Missing since 1982, there were more questions now than ever. Who had buried them? Why were they tied? How had no one found this for over 40 years? And why, just weeks after Thomas and Daniel's return, had the graves suddenly revealed themselves? Calhoun had his suspicions. The town had its theories. But only 2 men knew the truth. And they weren't talking. Instead, they stayed silent behind Eleanor's closed doors. And the people of Stonebridge, who once believed time had buried the past, were beginning to understand. Some secrets were never meant to stay hidden. And some people come home not to find peace, but to prepare for what's coming to in the summer of 1982. Stonebridge was a different place. The town still had its secrets, but the air felt lighter, the days longer, and the shadows less threatening. Children rode their bikes past dusk, and the woods that bordered the town were more adventure than danger. But for 4 boys that summer, what started as a simple camping trip would become the darkest moment in Stonebridge's history. Thomas Brooks, Daniel Pierce, Michael Rourke, and James Talley were inseparable. At 17, they believed themselves untouchable, old enough to be trusted, young enough to feel immortal. They spent most of their summer exploring trails, daring each other to climb trees, and talking about their future plans after graduation. That July, they decided to do something memorable. They would camp out in the forest near Miller's Creek, deep enough into the woods that they wouldn't hear traffic or see the glow of town lights. It was supposed to be one night away from the noise, the rules, and the boredom. They packed sleeping bags, flashlights, snacks, and a borrowed tent. They told their families they'd be back by morning. And just before sunset, the 4 boys hiked into the trees. Witnesses saw them laughing, carrying backpacks and dragging sticks. Through the dirt, the air was humid, thick with the smell of pine and moss. No one thought anything unusual about it. Boys camped in those woods every summer. They always came back, except this time, only 2 did. The next morning, just after dawn, Thomas and Daniel stumbled out of the forest, exhausted, dirty, and visibly shaken. Their clothes were damp, their faces pale. They arrived at the sheriff's office without saying a word. It took hours before they could speak. When they finally did, their story was vague. According to them, a sudden thunderstorm had swept through the woods in the middle of the night. The group had panicked. Michael and James had run off in the darkness, and Thomas and Daniel spent hours searching, calling their names, but couldn't find them. Eventually, they claimed they had no choice but to return for help. That a search team was formed immediately. Dozens of locals, police officers, and volunteers flooded the forest. Helicopters flew overhead. Dogs were brought in, but there were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, no abandoned gear, just one flattened campsite and two missing boys. The tent had been zipped, the fire burned out. It was as if Michael and James had simply vanished. The investigation dragged on for weeks. Every possible trail was followed. Locals were questioned. The remaining boys were interviewed separately, then together. Their stories remained consistent. They didn't know what happened. They wished they had stayed together. They were scared and confused. But something in their eyes unsettled Sheriff Calhoun. Something that didn't quite match their words. As weeks turned to months, public interest in the case faded. No arrests were made. No bodies were found. The families of Michael and James never gave up hope, but the town slowly began to move on. Some speculated that the boys had run away. Others whispered darker theories about accidents covered up, secrets taken to the grave. But without evidence, there was no closure. What no one expected was what happened next. By October of that year, both Thomas and Daniel left Stonebridge. Not just quietly, they vanished. No farewell, no plans, no warning. One day they were seen walking down Main Street. The next, gone. Eleanor Brooks said her son had gone to live with relatives in another state. The Pierces said Daniel was visiting cousins. But when pressed, neither family gave details. It was as though the town had collectively decided not to ask, as if not knowing was safer. For the next 40 years, the disappearance of Michael Rourke and James Talley became local lore. Their names were etched into a plaque outside the community center. Their photos hung on a bulletin board inside the police department. Every few years, a journalist would visit Stonebridge to write about the vanishing boys. The stories would come and go, but the mystery remained. Sheriff Calhoun never let go of the case. Even after retirement, he kept the files in a locked cabinet in his home. He'd pull them out occasionally, reading over the statements, the search, maps, the photos of the campsite. There were things that didn't make sense. Why had there been no signs of running? No panic at the site? Why had both boys disappeared without leaving a trace, but the others were unharmed? And most importantly, why did Thomas and Daniel leave town with such urgency? There was something else that bothered him, something buried in the statements. Daniel had mentioned seeing lights in the woods before the storm hit. He described them as flickering, like lanterns swinging in the wind. But Thomas had never mentioned the lights. In fact, he denied seeing anything unusual at all. Calhoun had highlighted the discrepancy in red ink. He asked them both about it during questioning, but neither would clarify. It was a detail that always stayed with him. Now, decades later, with the bodies found, those memories came flooding back. It was no longer a missing persons case. It was murder. The autopsy revealed that Michael and James had died from asphyxiation. There were ligature marks on their wrists and ankles, as if they'd been restrained. One had a fractured jaw. This wasn't the result of getting lost or attacked by animals. This was deliberate. The timeline no longer added up. If Thomas and Daniel had been searching for their friends that night, how had they not heard the struggle? How had they returned unharmed, without a scratch, while the others were buried in shallow graves? The theory of accidental separation crumbled under the weight of this new evidence. As news of the discovery spread, Eleanor Brooks stopped leaving her house. The front light that had been glowing each night now stayed off. Daniel, who had been staying in a nearby motel, was seen loading a duffel bag into his car late at night. He looked over his shoulder several times, like someone expecting to be followed. And Thomas, he grew increasingly withdrawn. He would sit for hours on the back porch, staring into the woods, not moving, as if waiting for something or someone. The town, once again, found itself at the edge of something it didn't understand. The return of the two surviving boys wasn't just a coincidence. It was a reckoning. Something had happened in those woods in 1982, something darker than anyone had dared to imagine. And now, after all this time, the truth wasn't just resurfacing. It was clawing its way out from beneath the soil. Sheriff Calhoun had seen many things in his long career, but nothing unsettled him like the return of Thomas Brooks and Daniel Pierce. It wasn't just the timing or the way they moved through town like ghosts. It was what came next. The discovery in the woods had confirmed what he'd suspected all along. Something terrible had happened in 1982. And now, after 4 decades of silence, the ground itself was finally giving up its secrets. The remains of Michael Rourke and James Talley had been found beneath a patch of earth that had collapsed after a heavy rain. When investigators began to excavate, they found more than just bones. There were ropes, now decayed but still knotted tightly. There were fragments of clothing, long rotted but faintly recognizable to those who had seen the boys. Last, most disturbing were the shallow carvings in the roots of a tree nearby. Initials, MR and JT. Almost as if someone had tried to leave a final mark, something to be remembered by. The town reacted with a mix of grief and anger. The families, now older and weathered by time, held each other at the press conference as officials confirmed the identities. Reporters came from out of town, swarming Stonebridge with cameras and questions. The headlines were brutal. Skeletons found in cold case. Town haunted by teenage disappearance. But beneath the noise, one question pulsed through every conversation. Who buried them? The answer seemed obvious to some. Thomas and Daniel were the last people to see the boys alive. They had told a story that now seemed like a lie. And just weeks after their return, the graves were found. But suspicion wasn't enough. Sheriff Calhoun knew better than anyone that without hard evidence, the truth could still slip away. The sheriff began to investigate again, unofficially. He visited the site himself, walking among the trees, taking photos with his old Polaroid camera. He paced the area where the boys had camped, noting how close it was to the shallow grave. Too close for comfort. He marked the trees with chalk, measured distances, took soil samples. He kept most of what he found to himself, knowing that the state investigators had their own procedures. But Calhoun was following something different, a feeling. Then came the next break in the case. A metal detectorist searching the nearby creek bed for coins stumbled across something wrapped in plastic and buried beneath a pile of stones. It was a journal, old, weathered, water-damaged, but mostly intact. The pages were yellowed, some were torn, but enough remained to tell a story. And it was Daniel's handwriting. The journal entries began in early July 1982, a few days before the camping trip. At first, it read like any teenager's diary. Complaints about parents, excitement over summer, jokes about school. But slowly, the tone shifted. Daniel wrote about strange things happening in the woods. He described hearing whispers at night, seeing figures in the distance, and finding animal bones arranged in strange patterns. He admitted he didn't tell the others, afraid they'd mock him. But he believed someone was watching them, the most. Chilling entries came in the days leading up to the disappearance. Daniel described an argument between the boys. Michael and James had wanted to go to the sheriff. They had found something, a pit in the woods filled with bones. Not animal bones, but human. Daniel wrote that Thomas tried to convince them it was nothing, just an old hunting site, but they didn't believe him. They talked about going to the police in the morning. Then came the final entry, dated the night of the trip. Daniel wrote that they had returned to the site to take photos as proof. But someone was already there. An old man, dressed in hunting clothes, standing by the edge of the pit. He told them to leave. He told them they had seen too much. The boys ran. Daniel and Thomas split from the others. After that, the entry became disjointed, Sentences trailed off, some scribbled out, some repeated over and over. We can't go back. He saw our faces. He said he would find us. The last sentence was underlined 3 times. We did what we had to do. Sheriff Calhoun read the journal in his study late into the night. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages. It was a confession, not to the murders, but to the fear, the pressure, the presence of something or someone else. Could it have been real? Or was it a creation of guilt? A way to shift the blame from themselves? The sheriff didn't know. But he had the journal authenticated. It was Daniel's handwriting. That much was certain. And when Daniel was brought in for questioning, he refused to speak. Not a word. Not about the journal. Not about that night. Nothing. Thomas, on the other hand, had started to unravel. Neighbors said they saw him pacing in the backyard at midnight, staring into the woods. He stopped eating. He barely slept. One morning, Eleanor found him digging in the basement, muttering to himself. When she asked what he was doing, he told her he was making space. Sheriff Calhoun visited Eleanor soon after. He asked to see Thomas, but she said he wasn't well, that he wasn't talking. Calhoun left a copy of the journal on the kitchen table and said he'd return the next day. That night, the lights in. The Brooks house stayed on until morning. The following day, Thomas was gone. They found his body in the basement. No signs of violence. No signs of struggle. He was lying on the floor, eyes open, mouth slightly parted, like he had been about to say something. The journal lay beside him, open to that final page. The one that said, "He saw our faces." Daniel vanished soon after. His car was found abandoned near the edge of the woods. The driver's side door was open. His wallet, keys, and shoes were inside. No sign of Daniel. No note. Just tire tracks leading toward the trees, and none coming back. The discovery of the journal changed the investigation, but it didn't provide closure. It raised new questions. Was there really someone else in those woods in 1982? Was the journal a genuine account or a twisted justification? And if Thomas and Daniel had truly been terrified all these years, what were they afraid of? Sheriff Calhoun stood at the edge of Miller's Creek days later, watching the wind move through the trees. He had thought that answers would bring peace. But the more he learned, the more he realized the truth was buried deeper than he had ever imagined. And the forest, silent and still, wasn't finished speaking yet. The journal had cast a long shadow over the town of Stonebridge. Though decades had passed since the night 2 boys vanished, the truth had never felt so close or so horrifying. But it wasn't just the discovery of the buried journal or the recovered bones that unsettled the town. It was what came after. Every door that opened seemed to lead to another, darker one. And as the story unraveled, it became clear that the truth wasn't just about 2 missing boys. It was about something far older, far more disturbing, hiding just beneath the surface of a quiet town. Sheriff Calhoun, already past his retirement, was now fully immersed again. The journal had become his obsession. He read it repeatedly, mapping out locations, marking details, comparing notes from the original 1982 case file. It was clear the boys had found something in the woods that they were never meant to see. A sinkhole filled with human remains. Not just 2 victims, dozens. The journal described bones, skulls, broken limbs, all stacked and partially buried. Michael and James had wanted to expose it. Thomas and Daniel had wanted to walk away. That detail changed everything. That a decision had been made that night, and whatever happened afterward had silenced 2 boys forever. But the question that clawed at Calhoun's mind was simple. Who put those bodies there in the first place? He organized a new search of the forest, with state investigators now fully involved. Unlike the casual searches of the 80s, this one was slow, calculated, forensic. Ground-penetrating radar, soil analysis, drones scanning from above. What they uncovered shocked even the most seasoned detectives. Nearly a mile from the original site, hidden beneath years of moss and brush, they found another burial site. But this time, it was structured. Seven bodies were uncovered over the course of 2 days. Each one buried in a separate pit, the same depth and width. The skeletons bore similar signs: rope burns on the wrists and ankles, and in some cases, bones that had been deliberately broken. These weren't accidental deaths. They were ritualistic, methodical. And then they found the cabin. It stood barely upright, collapsed in on one side, half consumed by the forest. It hadn't been used in decades. The roof was missing, and the wooden frame had rotted nearly to dust. But inside, there were signs of something much more sinister. Carvings on the walls, names, dates, crude symbols. One wall bore tally marks, hundreds of them. On a wooden table in the corner was an old, rusted hunting knife. Beside it, a tin box filled with teeth. Human teeth. Investigators photographed everything. Forensics began cataloging remains. Calhoun stood silently near the edge of the scene, hands in his pockets, staring into the trees. The journal had led them here. Daniel had known. And if he had known, so had Thomas. But if they weren't the killers, then who was? That question became harder to answer when records were pulled on the land where the graves and the cabin were found. Decades earlier, in the 1940s and 50s, it had belonged to a reclusive family named the Whitlocks. They'd lived on the outskirts of town, rarely seen in public, mostly self-sustaining. In 1951, the family, 2 parents and 3 children, vanished without a trace. Their home was abandoned, and though rumors swirled about their fate, no investigation had ever been launched. People assumed they'd moved away. Now, with the cabin unearthed and remains piling up, that assumption looked naive. Among the recovered items from the cabin was a sealed metal locker. Inside were photographs, black and white images, some faded beyond recognition, others still sharp enough to turn stomachs. They showed bound individuals, men, women, even teenagers, lined up in front of the cabin. The same ropes, the same positions. All of them appeared terrified. All of them were missing from history. Each photograph had a date scribbled on the back. The earliest was from 1938. The latest was from July 1982. The implications hit hard. The killings hadn't just occurred decades ago. They had continued. Someone, perhaps multiple people, had been operating in those woods for years, maybe generations. A private ritual, a pattern of silence. The final photo, dated the same week. Thomas and Daniel had camped there, showed 2 teenage boys. Bound, kneeling, faces pale, turned toward the camera. It was Michael and James. Sheriff Calhoun felt his legs give slightly as he stared at the photograph. This wasn't some buried memory. It was evidence, a record of murder. And if someone had taken this photo, then someone else had still been alive in 1982, continuing the cycle. Calhoun returned to Eleanor Brooks' house later that evening. The porch light was back on, the curtains drawn. He knocked once, then twice. No answer. He left the photo inside an envelope tucked under the door. That same night, a report came in from a local ranger. A car had been found deep in the forest, down an old hunting trail. It was Daniel Pierce's. Inside were remnants of supplies, canned food, water, and a large hunting knife. A trail of footprints led away from the car into the deeper woods, but ended at a rocky outcrop. There was no blood, no body. Just a small notebook on the front seat of the car. Inside it were only 3 sentences, scrawled in ink. He's still out there. I saw him again last night. He doesn't die. Those final words threw the investigation into chaos. Was Daniel unwell, haunted by guilt and delusions? Or had he truly encountered someone, something, in the woods that night in 1982 and again recently? The records, the photos, the graves. All of it painted a horrifying timeline. And yet one question remained unanswered. Who was the man in the trees? Sheriff Calhoun began sleeping with his bedroom window locked. Not because he believed in ghosts or legends, but because he had finally accepted something terrible. The forest wasn't just a place where bad things happened. It was a place that had allowed them to happen again and again. It swallowed screams. It buried evidence. It preserved secrets. Thomas Brooks had died clutching the journal. Daniel Pierce had vanished without a trace. But the real story was still hiding in those woods. The truth didn't die with the boys in 1982. It lived on in the soil, the bones, the photographs, and somewhere, just beyond the tree line, it was still watching.